and I'd like to welcome everyone to the Thursday, April 23rd, 2020 Planning Commission meeting. This meeting is by teleconference only. Mr. Commission Secretary, would you please call the roll?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Pickett.
Here.
Commissioner Strongman.
Here.
Commissioner Anderson.
Here.
Commissioner Ward.
Here.
Commissioner Reiser.
Here.
Vice Chair Kerselik.
Here.
And Chair Lezak.
I'm here.
All 7 are present and we may conduct business.
Thank you, Commission Secretary. So as stated earlier, this meeting is by teleconference only. This meeting is to be conducted pursuant to the provisions of the Governor's executive order, which suspends certain requirements of the Ralph M. Brown Act. Teleconference locations are not open to the public. To provide live remote public comment, please join the Zoom teleconference meeting. The meeting ID is 699-448-296, and the password is PC0423.
Mr. Chair, if I may interrupt for just a moment, there's actually a misread or a typo on that meeting ID. If I may repeat it for the benefit of the public. The meeting ID is 669-448-296, and the password was as relayed, P as in planning, C as in commission, 0423. Again, 669-448-296. Thank you. Pardon the interruption.
Thank you, Commission Secretary. I believe that's what I've got here. Somehow I must have misread that. So for those of you in the public who would wish to make public comment, when the chair opens the public comment period, use the raise hand feature, which will alert staff and commissioners that you have a public comment that you'd like to provide. And please wait your turn. And once brought into the meeting, state your name for the record, and you'll have 3 minutes to make your remarks. So at this time in the meeting, we'll move on to the consent calendar. I'm looking at the agenda. I do not see any consent items. So unless Commissioner Secretary, there's any commission items to be brought forward, we'll move forward to the next item on the agenda, which is the public communications portion. This portion of the meeting is reserved for comment on items that are not on the agenda. Under the Brown Act, the Commission cannot act on items raised during public communications, but may respond briefly to statements made or questions posed, request clarification, or refer the item to staff. At this point, does any member of the public wish to provide public comments? And if so, please use the raise hand feature, and I'll ask the Commission Secretary if there are any members of the public who would like to provide comments at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just again, to relay to the public, I know that there are multiple ways to tune into tonight's meeting, and we will take a brief pause for those of you who may be watching at home via cable on channels 26, 28, or 29, depending on your provider. There is an address at the bottom of your screen where you may join us, including the password for tonight's meeting. Further, if you are dialing in by phone and you don't have access to the internet, there is a number to dial to join this evening's meeting. That number is 669-900-6833. So if you're dialing in by phone, that is the number to call. At present, I do not see any members wishing to speak on this item. And one other, if I may relay one point, is just to remind the public, if you are watching from home via the city's website, we appreciate that, but also to know there's a 10-second delay typically between live commission proceedings and that which you're viewing at home. So hence my talking for at least 10 seconds or more to allow those at home who may wish to comment to log in. But again, Mr. Chair, I'm not seeing anyone logging in at this point during public communications, and we therefore have no one in the public wishing to speak.
All right, thank you, Mr. Commission Secretary. We'll go ahead and move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the public hearing for the Realty One Group Elite Conditional Use Permit application number Y20-028 for the address of 200 Pringle Avenue, suite number 100, with the assessor's parcel 174150077. And at this point, I'll go ahead and turn this over to staff for a staff presentation.
If I could just briefly interrupt before we begin that portion. Thank you, Haley, for preparing. But if we have any ex parte communications which the commissioners wish to relay, now would be a good time before we begin our hearing.
I had a brief conversation with Haley regarding this application, and I'm sure she'll fill us in on the items that I discussed with her, or I will raise them if she doesn't.
Thank you, Commissioner Pickett. Are there any other ex parte communications to report? Seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe it's now Haley's turn to present to the commission.
Great. All right, thank you. My name is Haley Crawford. I'm an associate planner here with the City of Walnut Creek. Tonight, I will be presenting a request from Realty One Group Elite for a conditional use permit for 200 Pringle Avenue, Suite 100. This is application Y20-028. A quick project location to orient us. 200 Pringle Avenue is located on the northwest corner of Pringle Avenue and North California. The subject tenant suite is Suite 100, which is located on the ground floor at that corner. So tonight, the applicant is wishing to establish a new 3,278 square foot real estate office, which will be located on the ground floor of the existing multi-story office and retail complex known as the Walnut Creek Center. Real estate offices are designated as business and professional office use in our zoning, the city zoning ordinance, and they do require a conditional use permit if they are located on the ground floor of a multi-story building, and that is per the mixed use plan development zoning district. So as I mentioned, the subject tenant space in question tonight, shown here in blue on the floor plan, is the corner tenant space of 200 Pringle Avenue. The applicant will not be proposing any sort of exterior changes to the building. If approved tonight, there will be an associated tenant improvement. I also just want to note here the image I provided shows that there is a unique kind of situation to this ground floor tenant space in that along North California, there is a grade difference between the tenant suite and the adjacent sidewalk, which presents a unique potential challenge for some retail uses that might want a more activated storefront. And so the real estate office tonight is proposing to occupy this space. So Realty One Group Elite, their business operations are Monday through Friday from 9 to 5. They have 10 full-time employees with several part-time employees who will be in the office only on occasion. They also have clientele that are by appointment only. So tonight, in order to consider the conditional use permit, there are required findings. The three on the screen here are the standard conditional use permit findings. I won't read them in detail, but they are the ones, if they are consistent with a general plan or any specific plan, that they essentially will not be detrimental to the public health, safety, or welfare, and any other required findings per the zoning. So the mixed-use plan development zoning does require an additional finding for a ground floor office use. The Planning Commission shall find that there is adequate on-site parking in accordance with the city's parking ordinance. So the, I should have mentioned earlier, I believe I missed that the subject tenant or the subject site is located within the North Downtown Specific Plan area as well. The North Downtown Specific Plan sets the, has specific parking ratios and 3.3 parking stalls per 1,000 square feet of rentable floor area. This ratio is the same for office and retail. So given the tenant suite, the tenant suite size, Realty One Group would be required 11 parking stalls. If we look at the entire complex as a whole, which is just over 2,000 square feet, the entire complex is required to provide 672 parking stalls. And the entire complex actually provides 675 parking stalls, 11 of which will be available for the Realty One group. So there, in fact, is a surplus of 3 stalls. So given that, staff is confident that there is adequate parking on site. And so staff tonight is recommending that the Planning Commission adopt the proposed resolution to approve the conditional use permit to establish the ground floor office use for Realty One Elite Group at 200 Pringle Avenue, Suite 100, application Y20-028. And I'm here if you have any questions. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll
Yeah,
go ahead and open the questions for staff from commissioners. Is there any commissioner who would like to begin by asking questions of staff?
Yeah, I'd like just to have Haley address, this is the question I asked her earlier. Just give us a brief overrun of what kind of uses would be applicable or appropriate for this space that would not require a conditional use permit.
Sure.
You don't have to run through all of them, just kind of a general idea.
Yep. So kind of in general, some of the main ones would be like a specialty food shop, retail sales in general. Some kind of more specific ones are like an optometrist office, but only if associated with the retail sales of, prescription eyewear. So primarily more of a retail focus would be permitted by right without a conditional use permit.
Thank you.
There's a quick question for Haley, if I may. It says there's 11 spots that it could have. There's 8 employees, or should have. There's 8 employees, so that leaves 3 extra. In terms of just general access into the building itself or into the parking facility, is it paid parking? And is there guest parking? Is there guest parking when you get to go in there?
I actually do not know if there's available guest parking. That would be a question we can ask the applicant, and they are here tonight as well.
Okay.
It's like to highlight that the standards applicable for parking within the city of Walnut Creek do consider both guest and required parking. It's a comprehensive number, just to provide a bit of background for the commission.
Thank you.
Any other commissioner questions for staff at this time?
Yes, I do. Can you see me?
Yes, I do. Sorry about that. Commissioner Strongman, go ahead.
Yes, just a couple quick questions. What was the occupant before?
I believe it was a stockbroker office,
Okay,
so similar use.
similar use. Thank you. And how do they expect their clients and agents to enter the office? Is it primarily from the front door, or are they coming in the back door to the parking garage?
I'll defer to the applicant on that one. I'm not sure if they arrive via vehicle or another way.
And one final question is on the actual resolution, section 3, number 4. I'm unaware of what Serum Innovations Inc. is.
That is part of our standard conditions. It just covers all sorts of outside agencies. I actually am unaware of what Serum Innovations is as well, and I'm not sure if it simply reflects that we need to update maybe some standard language, but this standard condition just basically speaks to all,
Okay.
covers all outside agencies.
Okay, because I actually Googled it and it didn't come up with anything that looked like it was related to the city.
It wouldn't be, and we can look into if that language needs to be updated.
Okay. No further questions.
I believe it's a public utility agency, but.
Not on Google.
Okay, so are there any other staff commissioner questions for staff at this time? All right, seeing none, we'll go ahead and open the public comment for this with the presentation by the applicant. The applicant will get 15 minutes to speak on this item. And then we'll move into the rest of the public comment. want to go ahead and shift to the applicant's presentation? Does the applicant have a presentation?
No, we do not have a presentation. My name is Mona Phillips, and I am the CEO of Realty One Group KMTM Holdings. Thank you so much for taking your time out this evening. These are some crazy times. We're all looking at each other through video. Seems to be my life now. So it's one video after another. So thank you so much. We are very excited to be part of the Walnut Creek family. We are currently located in Brentwood, but Realty One Group is all over the nation. This particular corner was very desirable for us from a perspective of not just what people can see from the exterior, but the inside is absolutely beautiful, an atrium, and we plan to really embrace this with a very luxury feel for a lot of the people that we will be serving, agents and clients as well. There was a question that was asked, which was, which way are people going to enter, from the garage or from the front door? We would obviously prefer the front door because that is the way to come in and out of the facility properly. So I just wanted to address that. There was another question, I'm sorry, I don't remember. I believe that came from Mr. Reiser.
It was related to guest.
That's right. It was related to guest parking.
Yes, and I think that was already addressed. Am I right?
Guest parking and regular required parking is all comprehensively included in the tally.
Right.
There was another part of that question had to do with, is it paid? I mean, is the garage a paid ticketed parking when you go in there as a guest?
I will leave that for Marilyn Banks, who is on this call. She is representing the landlord, and I think she would be best at answering that question. Marilyn, are you there? Marilyn?
Okay,
There
can
we
you hear
go.
me now?
Yes.
We can hear you, yeah.
Sorry, it was on the mute. The question, I believe, was parking again. I was trying to reach somebody to join the call as well.
For
There
access
is-
into the garage, is it ticketed parking? Is it validated, or how does a guest come in and park in the garage?
A guest would pull a ticket at the entry, and Mona can validate those for them, or they can pay via credit card or bank card.
Got it. Thanks, Marilyn.
Of course.
If I can ask a quick question of the applicant, we have two people in the waiting list, the attendees list, Christian Meza and Gwen White. Are either of them members of your team that we should promote to the panel discussion?
Gwen White would be a real estate representative for the landlord, but I'm not familiar with the other individual.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. As far as anything else from me, I wanted to keep it simple this evening, and that is all I have for you. If there are any other questions, I'm most definitely open to that.
Are there any other questions from commissioners of the applicant or the ownership team?
Nothing on our end.
No, nothing from our end either.
So I have another parking related question. I think the theme here is, of course, that might be the biggest concern. I see that, the employee number, I believe that was quoted was 10. You have 11 parking spaces. There are part-time employees that may come in. There, our guests, our clients that will come in. It's conceivable that at certain times the occupancy load may exceed your 11 parking spaces. My question is more about the overall building and the parking capacity of the building. How do we know of the 675 spaces? How is that regulated other than folks pull a ticket and are paying to get in? Is it possible that there would be a lot of capacity on any given day? So a handful of extra people above your 11 spaces would not be an issue at all? Or would, one or two extra folks on a particular day put the building at capacity? Is there anyone in your group who could speak to that?
This is
Marilyn?
Marilyn.
Go
Yeah,
ahead.
sorry. This is Marilyn, again, the property manager at Walnut Creek Center. One or two spaces for clients or other people working in the office is not a problem. There is also street parking, metered parking on both corner of North California and Pringle that offers extra parking, as well as we have another level in building 100 that has public parking. So there are opportunities around the property.
Marilyn, if you were to go by the property on a typical day, I mean, I know right now there's some vacancy. But how full is that parking lot? Is there a lot of vacancy in that parking lot right now?
That particular level that Realty One would be on is guest and monthly parking for a number of tenants in the building, and there are typically several spaces available.
Yes, we made sure of that. One of the biggest criterias for us was the parking, only because we're very familiar with the city and obviously the parking issues. So it was one of the things that we were very careful of. So I would just randomly show up at all sorts of different times just to monitor exactly if we would have enough parking for our guests and for our agents. And we were very satisfied. Every time I would go into the parking garage, there would always be parking. And then we would have other people, a manager that I had hired for that particular branch. She also is very familiar with working in that area, and she would go in and out randomly during a working day. We didn't seem to have any problems.
Okay, thank you for that. Are any other commissioner questions before we move on to open public comment? Okay, seeing none. At this point, we'll move on to the public comment portion of this public hearing. And we'll ask if there's any members of the public who would like to raise their hand and provide public comment. And please remember that we only get 3 minutes for public comment. Mr. Commission Secretary, would you please check to see if there's any members of the public that would like to provide comment?
Thank you, Chair Lezak. There is one member on the list in attendance. I do not know, or at least there's no hand raised at the moment. But for those who may be watching from home or maybe just tuning in via the city's online broadcast of this Planning Commission meeting, there is a slight delay between the city's feed on the internet, or if you're watching at home on cable, you're watching live. In either case, I'm trying to talk long enough to give you time enough to log in to the Zoom meeting and to enter the meeting ID, as well as the password, so that you can join us if you have any interest in raising a point or making a comment on this item. I believe I've spoken for a long enough time. Mr. Meza has not raised his hand, and no other speakers have appeared. I do not believe we have anyone wishing to speak on this item, and I've glanced at the public email account, and I have not found any emails to read into the record on this item.
Okay, Mr. Commission Secretary, we'll see if the applicant has any closing remarks that they would like to make.
I do not at this time. Thank you.
And are there any final questions the commissioners would like to ask of the staff or of the applicant before we close the public hearing? Okay, seeing none, we'll go ahead and close the public hearing. And we'll go ahead and move forward into the deliberation portion, where we'll give commissioners an opportunity to make their comments and assessments and see if anyone is interested in making a motion for action. Would anyone like to begin? The Commissioner Ward would like to begin. Go ahead, please.
It seems to me that this particular project is very complementary and similar to that which was in the space before, and I don't see any problem with that. I think the parking seems completely adequate, and I don't see any problem at all with it. I did want to note, and I know this is picky, but on page 2 of the proposed resolution, paragraph 1, paragraph 2 of that, we have encouraging waking, biking, and the use of public transit. So I think that should be walking. So if we could just fix that typo in the resolution, that would be great. Thanks. But that's the only comment I have. It looks like a great use of that space. So.
Yeah, I think it's an appropriate use for the space too. And a small drop in the bucket as far as parking goes, and there is plenty of street parking around there. So I don't think that's an issue, and I'd support the use.
Any other commissioners? Perhaps someone interested in making a motion for action?
Um,
Mr. Anderson?
I would move that we approve the resolution.
Second.
Commission Secretary, would you please call the vote, please?
Sure. Thank you, Chair Plezak. Commissioner Anderson?
Yes.
Commissioner Pickett?
Yes.
Commissioner Strongman?
Yes.
Commissioner Ward?
yes.
Commissioner Reiser?
Yes.
Vice Chair Cursilli?
Yes.
And Chair Lezak?
Yes.
The ayes have it 7-0. The motion's approved.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. So that closes the public hearing portion of our agenda this evening. And we will now be moving on to the commission considerations portion. Commission Secretary, I understand that we have a staff presentation this evening as part of our commission considerations. To make an introduction or turn that over to the appropriate staff person?
Sure. Happy to introduce Claire Lai and Brian Hickey, some of whom, or I'm sorry, most of you know Mr. Hickey. He is the attorney that serves the Planning Commission. Claire Lai is an assistant city attorney with the firm Myers-Nave, which is representing the city attorney's office here for the city of Walnut Creek. And I'll leave them to discuss further what they have to present for you this evening regarding the new housing laws that were passed and signed into law as of January 1, 2020, as a result of last legislative session. With that, Claire or Brian, please take it away.
Thanks, Ethan. Good evening, commissioners. I try to find a way to not see my own face when I talk here. Tonight, Claire and I are going to spend about probably the next 30 minutes discussing an overview and kind of a broad overview of the recent housing legislation that became effective as of January 1st, 2020. As commissioners are aware, housing has been a primary focus of the state legislature in recent years, and the 2019 legislative session was no exception to that. There were over 20 new bills related to housing that took effect as of January 1 of this year. And to put that into perspective a little bit, planning staff now meets, and Ethan can confirm this if I've got it wrong, but planning staff meets now bi-weekly, and they have meetings dedicated solely to tracking all of these new bills, making sure that the city is moving into compliance with the new bills, and sort of charting our progress as we move through the 2020 calendar year. So all of this legislation in 2019 has created a lot of new work for planning staff in 2020, just to kind of keep up with what's going on with the state legislature. Can we get the slides up there, or are they up there and can I not see them?
Yeah, we'll share screen here in a moment, Brian. There
Awesome. We are. Let's do that. That's great. And then can we move to the next slide? So like I said, there are over 20 bills that kind of comprise all of the housing legislation for this past legislative session. And so what we've done is we've grouped them into kind of 4 broad categories. And that first category is the ones you see in front of you, and those are laws affecting municipal control over housing development. And then if I go to the next slide, that's the second group is what we call, laws increasing the availability of housing sites. So think of, these are the bills that are aimed at, increasing the supply of housing sites and locations where housing can be built. Next slide. The third group, and I'm moving through these because we're going to talk about them more in particular as we move through, but these are just kind of the broad outlines. This third group, we're calling, assistance in finance and development of affordable housing. And these are specifically focused on affordable housing development, not just housing in general. How do we increase the supply of affordable housing, and how do we promote affordable housing, and how does the state help affordable housing pencil for developers? Next slide. And then the fourth category is laws regarding tenants' rights and homelessness issues. So think of, you've got a lot of bills that are aimed at increasing housing supply, and then these are the bills that are aimed at keeping folks keeping folks in place in their existing housing, and so these are aimed at doing that. So those are sort of the four broad categories. Next slide. So that first category, municipal control over housing development. Next slide. SB 330. SB 330, we can go to the next slide. SB 330 is probably the most comprehensive of all of the new bills that were passed in 2019. And from a 30,000 foot level, it's essentially designed to limit a city's ability to regulate or deny a housing project. So that's kind of the 30-foot or the 30,000 foot view. It's aimed at constraining a city's ability to deny a housing project, and it's aimed at speeding up the review and approval process of housing projects. It applies to affected cities, and Walnut Creek is an affected city, along with, I think according to HCD, 445 of the 482 cities in the state are deemed affected cities. So if you're not an affected city, you're very rural and very far away from any urban population. And SB 330, what it does is it amends the Housing Accountability Act, and that's a set of laws that's been around since the early 1980s. And generally, what the Housing Accountability Act has done is it constrains the city's ability to deny housing projects that are otherwise consistent with the general plan and zoning requirements. And so over the years, there have been various amendments to the HAA, and those amendments, as time goes on, sort of bolster that act and constrain cities' ability to deny projects. Next slide. So again, SB 330 operates from the general premise that there's a current housing crisis and that California needs to expedite the production of housing. So that's the worldview behind the legislation. With that premise, a lot of SB 330 focuses on project review and approval of timelines. And so we're going to go through that now. So what can't an affected city do under SB 330? So this is sort of the broad view of the prohibitions of SB 330. And number one, you can't create or enforce existing policies on land where housing is an allowable use. So examples of that are, you can't change the zoning designation to a less intensive use. So the examples there are reductions in height, FAR, increasing of setbacks. Basically, you can't downzone the property. Second, you can't adopt housing moratorium or reduce potential housing stock. So actions that reduce potential housing are prohibited. So think about Measure A, height limit is already in place. So that's allowable because it was already in place. But something like that now could not happen under SB 330. And then next is cannot enforce non-objective design standards adopted after January 1st, 2020. And I think I kind of hit on, growth control ordinances, et cetera, are no longer allowable. So basically you can't downzone property. You can't make property less available through your general plan and zoning ordinances. Next slide. One more back. Thanks. There we go. Specifically under SB 330, you can't approve a housing project that would demolish residential units unless the project actually creates at least as many units as will be demolished. So this is site specific. So going forward, you can't have a project that takes 10 units, demos them, and creates 3 single family residences. You've got to at least replace the site with the same number of units that were demolished. And then there's a separate category of units that are called protected units. And protected units are units that are either formally regulated as affordable housing. They can be subject to rent control, but under that definition are also more colloquially units that are occupied by lower income households, and they have their own restrictions. So you can't approve a project that would demolish occupied or vacant protected units unless all of the following apply. You've got to replace the demolished or protected units. You have to build a project that has the maximum number of overall units at the site that were there in the last 5 years. You have to allow existing residents to stay until 6 months before construction. And with respect to protected units, a developer is obligated under state law now to provide a relocation benefit that I believe constitutes about 1 month's rent. Or you've got to provide a right of first refusal to the tenant to be able to have a unit in the new development, or to be able to occupy a comparable unit in the new development. So you either have to pay relocation or you have to allow that tenant first rights to have a new unit. Next slide. So all of that said, what can a city still do under SB 330? I alluded to this before. You can still enforce voter established measures like height limits, but you can't adopt new ones. And to be clear, that means that, a lot of state law does not take the power out of voters with initiatives to be able to adopt their own zoning ordinances, but this does. So not only could the city not do this, but the voters cannot override provisions of SB 330 either. Under SB 330, you can still obligate developers and applicants to comply with CEQA. Coastal Act's not applicable. And you can still change, the city can still rezone property, but what we have to do is we basically have to, if you downzone property in one area, you've got to upzone it in another area, so to speak, so that there's no net loss in what we're calling residential capacity. So you can shift where you put residential, but you can't reduce the capability. And then next slide. Oh, actually, at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Claire to Claire's going to go into more specifics about project review and approval and some of the new requirements under SB 330 that are specific to staff approval and to commission approval of these projects. And I should point out, as I'm rambling on, if anyone has any questions, we're going to try to stop at various points to allow folks to ask them as well, and not necessarily wait till the end. So I'll let Claire sort of finish SB 330 in this part 1, and then we'll pause for any questions.
All right, thanks, Brian. Good evening, commissioners. I'll continue to talk about some of the significant changes that are brought by SB 330. Can we share the screen again? Great, thank you. So this next change is to, as Brian was saying, the Housing Accountability Act, and the way that housing projects are reviewed by the city. And so this slide here with the colored marking shows you what's been affected in the general principle of the HAA. As we were discussing, the HAA is a long-standing provision of law that limits how cities can deny or reduce the density of a project that is complying with the general plan zoning subdivision standards that are in place at the time the application is deemed complete. I think this in the past that this law hasn't been used very much, but now, as you may recall, in 2018 and again in this year, the HIA was amended to significantly expand its scope and place restrictions on the city's ability to deny a reduced density for these projects. So generally under the HIA, if a housing development project complies with all the objective standards and policies at the time that the application is deemed complete, the city can only deny that project or reduce its density if it would cause a specific adverse impact, or rather the city would have to find that the project would cause a specific adverse impact to public health and safety that can be reasonably mitigated. If the city doesn't make this finding or denies a project or reduces density of the project in violation of the HIA, the court can issue orders and sanctions to the point where I think the fine is $10,000 a unit. The court can order the city to comply. It can also overturn the city's order or the city's disapproval and issue the building permit instead. So that's the overall where the law stands before the changes. And so we'll go on to what has been changed. So next slide. So this chart illustrates the changes that are introduced further by SB 330 to the Housing Accountability Act. And the first one is that objective standards under the HIA has now been defined. Previously, it wasn't defined, but now this law looks to SB 35 and adopts that definition, which means that objective standards are those that don't involve any personal or subjective judgment, and those that can be verified against a known benchmark. An example of that would be, a setback of 4 foot. That's an objective standard. If the setback for the house is 4.5, then it's not compliant. So that's something that's easily quantifiable and it can be measured against a benchmark. Another example was that's not objective is where that there's a general description of an architectural standard that says the house has to be visually pleasing or architecturally compliant or consistent with all the houses in Walnut Creek, or something like that, which is very general, very kind of overall description without any further details. That's not considered objective standard. And the next two lines illustrate a new concept relating to a preliminary application and the ability for developers to kind of lock in what kind of standards are applicable to their project with the submittal of that application. And so previously, before SB 330, the standards that the city may impose for a project is those that are objective and that are in effect at the time of an application being deemed complete. And the definition of an application being deemed complete is that it complies with the city's traditional planning checklist. As you know, the checklist is required by state law, and the city requires what information is on it, and it checks for completeness. And so at the time, the application was deemed complete based on that list as we know it. The standards are set at that time frame. However, now SB 330 introduced the concept of a preliminary application, which is basically, we'll go over this in a little bit, but it's basically a set of items that are specified by state law. The city has no ability to ask for more in addition to that. And it's basically a simplified application, right? So if the developer submits that application, then they are able to lock in those standards at the time that are in effect at the time of that submittal. So relatedly, the next line, when the developer submits the application, they kind of, set it that they grab the set of standards that are in effect at that time. And I will know that this only applies to non-legislative acts. So if the project involves a legislative action, like a zoning amendment or a general plan amendment, those can't be locked in, so that wouldn't apply to them. And if the city didn't comply with the HAA, there's additional sanctions that the court may issue. So previously, if the city failed to make findings of an adverse impact when it denies a project, or it acted in bad faith and denying a project, the court can issue sanctions. And now, in addition to that, the city, if it required projects to comply with standards that are imposed after the preliminary application has been submitted, then the court can also issue sanctions for that purpose. Next slide. So what is a preliminary application? And in more detail, it's basically a simplified submittal that contains all of the information that's listed under SB 330. The city can't add anything to it, can't say we want to determine whether or not this application is complete because we wanted these additional information. It's basically the city checking off a box saying, does it comply with the things that are listed in the statute? And some examples of things that can be on the preliminary application includes, the location of the project, the proposed land use for the site plan, easements, subdivision approvals, any density requests, concessions, waivers. If there's hazardous waste on the site, and those information can be included on the preliminary application. So once the applicant satisfies that, submits the application, then they lock in the applicable standards and policies for the purposes of reviewing the project under the Housing Accountability Act. Next slide. However, there are some caveats for the developer to take advantage of this preliminary application. And as you can see, this is really the legislature wanting housing to actually be built instead of just being entitled. So in order to take advantage of the preliminary application, the developer has to submit the complete application pursuant to the city's list of requirements. That's the traditional planning checklist as we know it. The developer has to do that within 180 days after submitting the prelim application. And then they also have to commence construction within 2.5 years of the final project approval. And so if the developer fails to do that, then the city would be able to apply a standard that changed or came into effect after the preliminary application submittal. And also, one thing I would point out is that if the developer modifies the project so that the total number of units or the square footage changes by more than 20%, their advantage with the preliminary application goes away and they no longer have the benefit of the locked-in standards. And also, the city is able to apply certain other things to a project with a preliminary application that's been submitted. For example, if it's a fee adjustment, if your impact fee is adjusted by CPI annually, then the developer does still have to pay that amount annually. If the city is trying to do something to mitigate impact on a CEQA, that's also a permitted standard to be applied after the submittal of a preliminary application. And finally, the city can apply a standard after the preliminary application has been submitted to address a specific adverse impact, but that likewise requires the city to make findings and has to rely on evidence in the record to show that there was such an impact. Next slide. And so finally, the other change that SB 330 makes to limit local control is to shorten the time period for project review. Most significantly, the city may not hold more than 5 hearings on a project if it complies with the objective standards in place at the time when the application is complete. And for the purposes of this 5 hearing rule, the complete application is based on the traditional planning checklist. And so after the developer submits the items that are required by the city rather than just required by state law, the city would have to basically do the project within 5 hearings. And these include the traditional, planning commission, city council reviews, but it also includes the subcommittees of the commission's workshops or similar meetings that the city conducts for the project. Also, the city has less time to approve a Housing Accountability Act project after certifying an EIR. And similarly, if the city has to determine whether or not a project is located on a historic site, if it's required to do so by state law or by a local ordinance, then it must do that at the time the application is deemed complete. And so those are the timelines that have been shortened. And next slide, please. Okay, so now I will turn over to Brian to talk about some other restrictions on local control, and that's the accessory dwelling unit regulations.
Thanks, Claire. Make sure my mic's back on there. So in addition to SB 330, some of the legislation from 2019, there were also 3 bills that were specifically aimed at ADU regulations. And AB 881, next slide. AB 881 was specifically requires that ADUs be allowed on all residentially zoned lots. So this includes both single family and multifamily lots. So if residential is permitted, then ADUs are permitted. And the way that works is on a single family lot, you have to allow at least 1 attached ADU to the primary structure and at least 1 detached ADU. And then you're also permitted by right to have a JADU, a junior ADU, that is attached either to the primary structure or to the detached ADU structure. And just to confirm that we're all sort of working off the same terminology, a JADU is generally a smaller ADU. I think our own ordinance defines it as less than 500 square feet, and it may or may not have a bathroom. So the JADUs generally are a bedroom kitchen setup, and it may share a bathroom with either the larger ADU or with the primary residence. So those are allowed now under the new legislation. And then in multifamily residential, you must allow a number of attached ADUs that are equal to at least 25% of the overall multifamily units. So the example would be if you had a 20-unit multifamily development, by right, you're allowed to include 5 or build either at the time of construction or to add on later, you're allowed to build 5 ADUs. And then in addition to that, you're allowed 2 detached ADUs on multifamily property. So that's generally what AB 881 does. Other provisions that relax the restrictions on ADUs. There's a further relaxing of setback, parking, FAR, height requirements. Owner occupancy requirements are prohibited with ADUs. I think you still may be able to enforce them with respect to a JADU, but with respect to ADUs, there's no longer the ability to require owner occupancy. And then ADUs constructed after January 1, 2020, they must be rented for 30 days, so they can't be used for short-term rentals. This law is new, and we're still figuring it out, but it's not clear if that applies to all post January 1, 2020 construction or construction that takes advantage of. There's now a requirement, in addition to what we just went through, there's also a requirement that the city's basically got to relax virtually all of its development standards to allow a detached ADU on any residential lot. So this isn't multifamily, but on a single family lot, if it's less than 800 square feet and it's less than 16 feet in height, it's allowed by right. And you've, as a planning staff and as a planning commission, you basically got to work with the developer and allow them to fit that on the parcel. So that's a new requirement under AB 881. Next slide. The sorry, AB 68. Again, I think we've covered that already. The one thing I would point out is that part of the legislation also confirms that individual CC&Rs are now preempted by state law. So, any typical residential development in the past that might have CC&Rs that says you can't build an ADU, you can't build a JADU, you can't build accessory structures. Those are all now null and void, and state law preempts those types of restrictions. And then SB 13, that's basically a bit of a catch-all that's designed to allow folks who might have unpermitted ADUs to kind of come out of the shadows and petition the city to not take code enforcement action against those structures for a period of up to 5 years to allow them to come into compliance. So again, designed to kind of preserve potential housing stock that is out there already. And I guess to sort of conclude on ADUs, kind of where are we now in Walnut Creek? So AB 881 had a specific provision in it, and what it said was if any local agencies ADU regulations contravened state law as now adopted effective January 1, 2020. If local regulations contradicted those new state laws, then any local ordinance was null and void. And they were fairly non-specific in a way that made it appear that your entire ADU ordinance would be null and void if any portion of it did not comply with state law. And so because of that, back in December of 2019, we did take an urgency ordinance to the city council. And the purpose of that ordinance was specifically to adopt an urgency ordinance, just bringing the city's ordinance into compliance with these new regulations. That was done in December of 2019 under the government code. That urgency ordinance was then extended in January 2020, and that ordinance is now in place through December of 2020. And so where we are now is the city is currently working on an updated permanent ADU ordinance, and the Planning Commission will see that ordinance obviously prior to it going to the city council for ultimate consideration and adoption. So I heads up that this is coming your way. And with that, I'm gonna kick it back to Claire to continue here. And I think we may have finished part one, if I'm not mistaken. Can't see the next. Let's go to the next slide. Not quite. Parts 2, 3, and 4 are a lot shorter, we promise.
All right, thanks, Brian. Yes, I promise this next part is shorter. So to wrap up part one, which is the new laws that limit municipal control over the development of housing, there's also changes to SB 35. And as you may recall, this SB 35 is the new statute from 2018 that is attempting to streamline approval of housing, depending on whether or not the local jurisdiction has approved enough units based on income category with respect to its RHNA obligations. And so, next slide, please. So this one change I'm going to talk about fairly quickly because fortunately it won't apply to Walnut Creek so far. So the change is to the developer's obligation to set aside units in order to get the benefit of SB 35 streamlining. And so if a city has not issued enough building permits to meet its RHNA obligations for above moderate housing, existing law requires a project in order to get the benefit of that streamlining under SB 35 to set aside more, if it's more than 10 units, then it must set aside at least 10% of that total units for low income housing in order to qualify. And now, in addition to that option, the project, if it's in the Bay Area, then instead of reserving 10%, it may instead dedicate 20% of the units to affordable housing that for households that's making 120% AMI with an average income at or below 100% AMI. And households in these units can't spend more than 30% of their income on housing. So that's basically just an additional option for developers to utilize in order to get the benefit of streamlining. And so I say that it won't apply to Walnut Creek now, and perhaps even can confirm that we're on track, as I understand it, to meet our above moderate housing obligations for RENA.
Yes, we are.
Okay, yeah, so for right now, 2019, we're on track, enough units, and so this won't kick in for the city at this point. And next slide, please. Also, there's some other changes to SB 35. They're not significant, but more like clarifying changes. So one, when calculating the square footage that qualifies a project for SB 35, underground spaces don't count towards that square footage. So think parking spaces, basement, that kind of space, they don't count for the square footage. And also, the new law clarifies that approvals under SB 35 remain valid for 3 years if construction is in progress. And so they define what that means. So for example, if you pull the building permit, that counts as in progress construction, and cities may grant a one-year extension, but that's a pretty minimal standards for developers to meet. And related to that, if that 3-year approval expires, the city pretty much has to give them subsequent development permits because the law requires that. And if the project is substantially the same or substantially complies with the development as it was approved before, then pretty much the city has to give them subsequent permits if their initial 3-year approval expired. And finally, there's a change to CEQA where it exempts BART when it leases, conveys, or encumbers its land related to development. Approval, streamlined approval. This pretty much is a change that takes away some of the land use controls with respect to BART, and so we'll see how that plays out. The next slide, please. There's some new CEQA exemptions. Next slide, please. So this is another example of the legislature trying to, relieve some of the regulatory restraints for certain projects in order to promote kind of transitional housing programs. So Senate Bill 450 creates a new CEQA exemption for interim motel housing projects, which is those that convert a structure into a motel, a hotel, or transitional supportive housing that meets both of the following requirements. So one, if the floor area of the unit in the structure is expanded by 10% at most. And two, if the project does not result in any significant traffic, noise, air, or water quality impacts. And related to that, Senate Bill 744 now requires supportive housing only comply with the objective standards applicable to other kinds of multifamily developments that's in the same zone. And also it similarly exempts those projects from CEQA if it's for supportive housing or funding applications for No Place Like Home, similar housing programs. So those just are basically relieves for these kinds of housing programs from regulatory restraints. And next slide, please. Okay, so we have finished part one. Before I move on to part two, perhaps I'd like to see if anybody has any questions. We have to answer them.
I got a couple of quick questions, if you don't mind. So my first question is about SB 330. And the first question is, have we had any applications submitted to the city that are SB 330 applications? That'd be a new project, preliminary application after January 1.
No, we have not.
And, one of the things I noticed about that is that it requires a maximum number of 5 hearings. And so, knowing how our process works, some projects seem to go to design review 5 times. Is there a discussion going on in the development staff about how to streamline our process or how to make this more efficient through, sessions, things of that nature?
Yeah, I'll be quick on this response, but the short answer is yes. There have been several efforts to develop objective design standards that would apply. That's a key term throughout the Housing Accountability Act and SB 330, which modifies the Housing Accountability Act. I'd also note that we are thinking through, given the parameters of or the limited parameters of review, we're thinking about, and this is one of the reasons we wanted to come both to the Planning Commission and later in May to the Design Review Commission, is that our process is going to have to change by force of state law, and also, by force of state law. And so the customary process we have enjoyed in the city of Walnut Creek is going to have to change to some degree. And so staff is busy at work this first quarter of this new year. Of course, we are also now distracted with the COVID-19 pandemic, but we are still making valid efforts. We are applying for state grants to help, which are made available to all cities, actually. They're a non-competitive grant process. We're trying to take advantage of that so we can use more of those funds to help us develop standards and put them into place to accommodate SB 330 type projects. And if I were to be betting, I would imagine that the state is likely to provide more solutions for cities to consider in the future. So we want to make sure we're prepared for that.
Okay, thank you. I mean, it would be a shame if because of this, we had to lose the luxury of doing study sessions. It seems to me that this is very helpful for us and it's probably for applicants in terms of moving their project forward. So it would be unfortunate if we'd have to eliminate those to be able to meet this arbitrary hearing number requirement.
Agreed.
The other thing I'd point out is that this applies. This 5 meeting requirement maximum is going to apply when you've got a project that comes in and it already is compliant with the general plan or specific plan and zoning. But when we get into legislative decisions, if someone comes in and it requires a general plan amendment or it requires an ask of the commission and the council to rezone, then that cap won't apply in the same way, because you're not just limited to specifically an SB 330 project at that point.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. And I guess my last question has to do with the fee structures. And it seems very interesting now that fees are going to be set and limited to those fees that are in place at the time of your preliminary application. And the only fee increases that one would be subject to would be if it was tied to a CPI or an engineering news record or some other published number, as opposed to an annual report, which has been the standard for the city, I think, in terms of the analysis. How has staff looked at that in terms of this year's? I think we normally do a July 1st fee increase. I can't remember what the date is, but how has this law affected how the city looks at that?
So we are looking at, obviously there's a lot, budget is a hot topic for a variety of reasons, mostly related to the COVID pandemic. But to your point, we are looking at the indexed manner in which fees may be increased. We usually do a fee, losing track of my words. There's a master fee schedule that the council adopts during its budget cycles, and that'll be part of this year's budget discussion. We don't necessarily have any proposed increases relative to these applications, but I will say that we are talking about them. As I mentioned, we don't have any SB 330 projects yet. However, we are in the course of adopting a 1-year budget, and we may revisit and likely will revisit that master fee schedule upon the adoption of the FY 22-23 budget sometime next year, opposed to later this summer. So it's something we're thinking about, and we'll have more to report back to council and others in the future.
Okay, and just a couple of very short, quick ones so that we can keep this moving. And that is the other things we talked about were ADU legislation and then this SB 35. Have we had an appreciable increase in ADU applications in the last couple of years, particularly since June of this year, because of the changes in these ADU laws?
It's an interesting question and appreciate you asking. We have seen an uptick in the number of applications, but we're not sure if that's attributable to, without getting too far into the weeds, the way in which we have been tracking ADUs and considering ADUs has varied a little bit over the past. And I can tell you that in this current year, over the last year, we've had about 25 to 28 applications for ADUs, which outpaces prior years. But again, going back into our permit records, there are some discrepancies that have been, unfortunately, perhaps undercounting some of the ADUs that we've had. All legally issued building permits, but perhaps classified for a variety of reasons, not simply as an ADU, but as another type of housing. And so we have been going back through this process. We've been going back through our permit history to try to figure out the long-term trends, whether it's to ADUs here in Walnut Creek. But I can tell you recently we've had, as I said, in the order of up to 30 applications for ADUs this year. So we have noticed an uptick.
Okay, and then SB 35, or have we had any SB 35 projects?
No, and that's, I think, attributable to the fact that half the threshold, because we have done well relative to moderate housing production, the applicability of SB 35, and if Claire wants to jump in on this, I know that they put together a checklist, but my understanding is because of our production levels on moderate income units, that we are a 50% jurisdiction, meaning if anyone were to take advantage of SB 35, nearly, 50% or more of those units would have to be affordable by nature. And typically, given the economics, and you may know this yourself, Chair Lezak, when you get into that kind of a number, you're usually talking, you're not going to do a 50% project, you're probably going to do a 100% affordable project. And we have worked with nonprofits and others to encourage that kind of development. So we haven't seen a mix of a, let's say, market rate 50% affordable project taking advantage of SB 35 here in Walnut Creek.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions from commissioners? Commissioner Strongman?
Yes, going back to SB 330, can citizens initiate a lawsuit to overturn the city's decision to approve, or could they also do a petition to force a special election to overturn the approval of a project?
So I'll let Claire jump into, but the short answer I believe is no, meaning that projects that comply with SB 330 are compliant under state law and those provisions, and a voter initiative can't overturn that.
Correct. And I just add that they do have the ability to sue if we don't approve them. So in the opposite direction, but they don't have the ability to say you must, your approval is wrong, and therefore we're challenging that.
Thank you.
In effect, the restrictions on the city and on the electorate with respect to a ballot initiative.
Okay, additional questions? I think I saw Commissioner Anderson.
Right. Thank you for the very detailed presentation. I just want to make sure I confirm that although AB 330 puts a lot more teeth into the Housing Accountability Act, it's all in terms of processing and permitting and approvals. The city is still not under any obligation to actually build or to fund that housing. Is that correct? There's nothing new on that score.
That's correct.
And the other question was, obviously they're trying to limit what the city, or the citizens of the city can do to delay or stop affordable projects or housing generally. One of the key approaches to accomplish a delay and perhaps a defeat of additional housing, has always been, or has for many years been, suing on CEQA grounds. Although there were some very specific things for which they granted CEQA exemptions, I didn't see anything in the various legislation about actually limiting lawsuits through CEQA. Is that correct?
That's
it.
Okay. I just want to confirm that. Thank you.
Hope Claire and I agree every time we answer at the same time.
That's
Commissioner
Why don't you
Pickett?
get the same answer?
Yeah, just a clarification. I don't know what page number it is, but it was on the SB 300. It had at the top, affected city may continue to, and the first item there is enforce voter established height limits, et cetera. And I'm wondering how or if that relates at all to the building that is under construction at the former Fuddrucker site, which I understand. We of course never saw it as a planning commission, but I understand that one exceeded the Measure A height limit. So how does that relate to that specific project? And does that mean that Measure A throughout the city from now on is still enforceable?
That's a great question, and it's actually very timely. You'll see in about 5 minutes when we continue and we talk about density bonus. But the complicated answer to that is Measure A is still fully enforceable, but it is subject and subordinate to state density bonus law. And so that project in particular was able to pierce the height limit, if you will, based upon concessions and incentives that were granted pursuant to state density bonus law. So it's enforceable, but the exception to that is state density law. State density bonus law does override that development standard.
So Bob, just to be clear, that's different from SB 330, which amends the Housing Accountability Act, yet another state law from the past that encourages housing production. The state density bonus law is another mechanism that developers can take advantage of, and that's what the owners at 1910 NOMA did.
Any other commissioner questions of staff before we continue the presentation? Okay, seeing none, I'll go ahead and turn it over to our esteemed assistant city attorneys. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Lezak. Once we get the PowerPoint back on.
This
is, yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
Okay, so the next part of the new laws relate to enhancing availability of housing sites. And this is from both angles. One, from making land actually available to build housing, and two, making the information about where land is available more transparent and more available to developers, to housing communities, and to the public. And so if we can go to the next slide. Actually, go 2 slides, one more slide. Oh, yeah, thank you, great. So the first change is to the Surplus Land Act. And I'll just briefly go over what this law requires as it was existing before the change. As you may be aware, the Surplus Land Act has a set of procedures that the city must follow before it can dispose of such as selling or leasing land that it considers surplus. So the city has to first provide notice to other public agencies, for example, school districts, parks and recreation agencies, and affordable housing developers before it can sell or lease the land. And if those entities are interested in buying or leasing the property, then the city has to negotiate with them. They don't have to agree, but they have to negotiate for at least 90 days to try and reach an agreement on the price and term. And the purpose of doing this is so that land is available for open space, for recreation, and affordable housing before it can be disposed of for other purposes. Next slide, please. So the new changes to this law is that now residential use has to be an acceptable use for the Surplus Land Act. And this comes into play in the sense that the city is really wearing 2 hats at times when, especially in a transaction like this, where it's both the regulator and it's also the proprietary landowner. So it's acting in both capacities when it's disposing disposing land. And so now there's more restriction on what the city can do in terms of thinking like a market participant, right? Like thinking in the role of a landowner. And so the city cannot impose sales conditions that disallow residential use of the site. It can't reduce residential units or maximum lot coverage beyond what is required under zoning or general plan standards. It also can't impose design or architectural standards that would have a substantial adverse effect on affordable housing. And further, the city can only limit residential use or density as a term of the sale if it finds that there is a specific adverse impact to health and safety, and there's no feasible way to mitigate that impact. So that's similar to how the city has to do things under the HAA, and that's the similar finding it has to make. And finally, the city has to report information about the sale to HCD before agreeing to the sale. The intent of that is that the HCD would have some kind of oversight ability to basically monitor that kind of disposition and make sure that there is more land offered for opportunities to develop affordable housing. Next slide, please. Okay, and the next set of changes is from the other angle to make data about where available sites are more available and more transparent. So next slide, please. And the first set of changes is to the inventories of land that's suitable for residential development. So currently the city has to include in its housing element an inventory of sites that's suitable and available for housing development. The new change imposed by Senate Bill 6 is that the city must compile this inventory using the forms and the standards that HCD has put in place. The city also has to submit them electronically to HCD, and again, that's intended for HCD to try and compile a statewide database to show the available sites that are in the state. Next slide. It also, somewhat related to that, the city has to post certain housing development data now on its website and update them within 30 days of any changes. So some examples are listed here. For example, fees, applicable zoning requirements, checklist information, the traditional planning checklist as we know it. If you have a condition of approval that relates to affordability, that has to be posted. Any financial reports on mitigation impact fees and nexus studies that are done after 2018 will have to be posted. And ACD is also directed to develop a 10-year housing data strategy. So relying on the data that it is provided, it's trying to basically create this process and saying, you know, how the housing strategy would work to target the housing shortage issue that we have. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so now we'll turn it over to Brian for some additional changes on financing and development of affordable housing.
Thank you. Do we want to make sure, were there any questions on that last part? Do we want to poll the commission?
I had a quick question. On, I think it's page 28, it says, what are the new changes? And the first bullet point is residential use must be an acceptable use for surplus land. Following paragraph says the city may not impose sale conditions that disallow residential use of the site. So is that saying, I mean, there's a contradiction in those two things, but is that saying that the primary issue is that it needs to be residentially zoned currently? Or how do those two things relate, those two statements?
My understanding is that just that residential use just has to be acceptable. The sale term can't carve it out. Sometimes I think that before there's new law that's sometimes a kind of a leverage or a negotiation that happens, but now you just can't do it.
So if a city owned some surplus property that was in a commercial zone, could a developer come in and build residential there? or retail or industrial.
Yeah, that's a good
I
question.
think-
Go ahead, Claire.
No, go ahead. I think it does still have to comply, and this is where you have this regulatory versus proprietary kind of capacity that's interplaying. So if the underlying zoning prohibits that, the city doesn't have to allow it, but it can't say in your sales terms that that's a prohibited use. That's my understanding.
Right. So I think you can't go out of your way to restrict residential. So if you're disposing of property that's not already zoned residential, it's zoned, to your example, it's zoned commercial, it's zoned office, it's zoned industrial. I think then you can dispose of that without any conditions, and it still retains its zoning. I think the issue is you can't take a property that currently is zoned residential and kind of restrict it in connection with that sale. And again, kind of going to the overall spirit of not having an ability to reduce current available potential housing stock.
Okay, so an example would be perhaps Shadelands area. I know the city at least owns the art facility, whatever you call it, thing out there. And I don't know if they own anything else in the Shadelands area, but then they could not, if they determined that art facility was surplus property and they wanted to sell it, they would sell it just as is, which is a commercial zoned area, or maybe zoned to something different for that, but that's definitely not zoned residential. This wouldn't give the buyer a green light to build residential in that surplus property. Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah, I believe that's correct.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Any other comments or questions at this point? We'll go ahead.
All right. If we could get the slides again. Thank you. Perfect. So we're going to now move into part 3, which is the financing and development of affordable housing. Next slide. And as Bob introduced earlier, we're going to talk about changes to state density bonus law. Next slide. And it might be helpful to just quickly talk about where state density bonus law was prior to January 1, 2020. So under density bonus law as it existed in 2019, under state law, a developer can get a density bonus of up to 35% of 35% additional units. They could get 1 to 3 incentives or concessions, and they could get an unlimited number of waivers with respect to affordable housing development. And the way all of those work under state law and under the city's density bonus ordinances, it's basically a sliding scale, dependent upon the combination of, very low, or moderate income units that are being provided. The developer then moves up that scale and gets up to 35% density bonus on the development, and gets between 1 and up to 3 incentives or concessions, and can also request waivers. And again, very quickly, just reviewing the current state of things, incentives and concessions, those are basically developer requests to relax development standards such as parking, setbacks, height. Those are examples of a developer can come in and ask for those incentives or concessions. And to add a little bit of perspective, going back a few years, the old standard for when a developer asked for incentives or concessions, they were evaluated through the lens of whether or not that incentive or concession was necessary to build the projects, to bring the project to fruition. And that standard, not with the new AB 1764, but a couple of years ago, that standard has already been revised. And the new standard, the current standard, is whether or not those incentives or concessions result in identifiable and actual cost reductions. So you've gone from a is it necessary to do the project? Does it reduce the cost of the project? And that's a very different standard, and one obviously designed to promote additional development of affordable housing. So what now happens with AB 1764 as of January 1, 2020, is that, and let's go to the next slide. So in addition to current state density bonus parameters, any project offering 100% density bonus, or I'm sorry, 100% of affordable units is now entitled to an 80% density bonus, 4 concessions or incentives instead of 3, still an unlimited number of waivers. And again, waivers are the standards higher. When you're asking for a waiver, you're saying, I can't fit the density that I'm allowed to fit under the density bonus with the current standards. So that standard's a little different. It's harder to get a waiver than a concession or incentive, but still unlimited amount of waivers. And then there are additional parking reductions under the new density bonus law, further reducing parking requirements. Next slide. And then again, another highlight is yet another layer. If you have a 100% affordable project and you're within a half mile of a major transit stop, you get all of the provisions that we just discussed: 80% density bonus, 4 concessions or incentives, waivers. But you also get effectively, you get a waiver of effectively all density controls within a half mile of a major transit stop. So you can effectively ask for as many waivers as necessary to kind of fit the 80% density bonus if you're within a half mile of a major transit stop. Next slide. This is just again, with respect to housing projects that qualify as special needs or supportive housing, no parking requirements if you're located within a half mile of an accessible bus route. Next slide. And I guess I did, while we were talking about density bonus, I did want to, before we move from that topic, I did want to kind of highlight where we are as a city. So first, I think it's important to point out that Walnut Creek's been somewhat progressive with density bonus law even before January 1, 2020. So again, the state scale goes up to 35%, but the city in its own local density bonus ordinance has traditionally granted an additional density bonus if you've got a project that's at least 50% very low income units or 75% low income units. The applicant's been able to apply for a CUP, and that CUP allows the applicant, if granted by the Planning Commission, allows the applicant to increase the density above 35%. And that has counted as one of the applicant's incentives or concessions. So the city has already, through its local ordinance in the past, had mechanisms for developers to even go beyond 35% density bonus with respect to affordable housing. As pointed out, the new legislation targets 100% affordable housing developments and jumps that density bonus up to 80%. As a city, where are we? Ethan can comment on this if he wants to, but to remind everyone, it's been what feels like an eternity, but there was a joint planning commission and city council meeting that had been scheduled for March 17th. And at that meeting, that was intended to be a study session on the new city's new density bonus ordinance that it's working on. That meeting obviously was canceled due to the countywide stay-at-home order, and that will be rescheduled. Ethan may have some more details on that, but as soon as things sort of settle down, if you will, that will be coming to the Planning Commission. And again, that ordinance is intended to incorporate the new state law requirements. And it also is investigating, again, a supplemental density bonus program that would be local and specific to Walnut Creek, and again would provide potentially, depending on the desire of the commission and the city council, would provide additional density bonus opportunities for those projects that are above what might qualify for 35% under state law, but below the 100% mark. So I'll leave density bonus at that, but that's where we are with density bonus. Next slide. And then there's just some other random bills that were also part of this 20+ bill effort by the state legislature. AB 1743 exempts affordable housing projects from community facility district taxes. The city can't find that lack of payment of those fees constitutes an adverse impact or a reason to deny a housing project. SB 196 is a welfare exemption for community land trusts. And AB 1487 is a little bit interesting. That created a Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, and that's now a regional authority that's got it's got the ability to issue bonds and to levy taxes, all subject to the normal voter approval of those tax measures. But it's now run through the MTC, that they're the overall administering board, and so they now have some powers to collect taxes and fees to promote affordable housing. Next slide. That finishes part 3. So maybe again we should ask if anyone has any questions.
I got some questions.
Go ahead.
If it takes too long an explanation, maybe you could tell us where to find the information, but what's the difference between concessions and incentives and waivers?
So I will fully admit that having done this for a number of years, I don't know that I can give you a good definition of what the difference is between an incentive and a concession. They are both proposed by the developer, and they are both a relaxation of development standards. So I to be honest, I don't know if I could really definitionally, they operate in the same way. I don't know that I could really split those hairs. A waiver is a little different. Again, incentives or concessions are designed as the developer can make the request, and the standard in evaluating those is, does that lead to cost savings on the project? Does it make it easier to develop affordable housing? So that bar is a little different. A waiver is essentially, I'm a developer, I've been granted a density bonus, I'm now allowed to develop a certain number of units on the site, and I'm arguing that I just can't do it with this specific development restriction. So there's, the height limit might be an example. There's something that is, I just can't make the project work if you don't waive this restriction. It could be parking. And so it's a little higher standard. And that's why they can ask for unlimited waivers. But again, they've got to prove that the project doesn't work without the waiver. Where the incentive and concession, it's more, they only have to show that it's cost beneficial to the project. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
As a planning commission, do we get to weigh in judgment on whether or not the developer's decision that saves money is in fact true?
You do.
We say we don't believe you.
You do. So the short answer is yes. So a developer has to, has to make the request and has to provide the backup for that request. That said, and one of the, I don't know specifically if it's as of January 1, 2020, or it was the prior legislation back in, I believe it was 2018. But the long story short is the burden of proof is now on the city. So it's not that the developer has to prove the cost savings. It's that if the city objects, the city has to prove that the cost savings does not exist. So in theory, we could ask for additional evidence. We could drill down a little bit, but ultimately the burden of proof is on the city. And if you will, the benefit of the doubt is with the developer.
Okay, another vague thing on this is, I think it said they can get 1, 2, or 3 concessions. How is it determined how many concessions they get? I think there was one condition that they could get up to 4 concessions. How is the number determined?
So under our current density bonus ordinance, and under what I presume will be our next iteration of the density bonus ordinance, the number of concessions goes up with the percentage of affordable housing being provided. So again, if it's very low, that percentage may be a lower threshold. If it's low income housing, that threshold might be a little higher, but it's basically a sliding scale. I don't have it in front of me. Ethan may be able to speak to it, but once you hit certain thresholds, I'm providing 15% of units are going to be low income units. I hit a certain threshold, I went from 1 concession to 2 concessions. I hit another threshold, I get to 3 concessions. And ultimately right now under state law, you max out with 35% density bonus and 3 concessions or incentives. So those increase with the affordable housing that's being provided along with the percentage of density bonus.
Okay. Last question is major transit stop. Is that defined anywhere?
It is. It's defined in the Public Resources Code, and I'm going to be honest. Clearly, it's BART. I don't know, and I don't want to put Ethan or Claire on the spot. I think it would also apply to certain bus stops potentially, depending on the volume, depending on the route and the volume of transit moving through there.
So is that something that we have knowledge of? Which sites within the city of Walnut Creek would qualify as major transit stops?
I'm going to defer to Ethan and not to put him on the spot to see. I don't know if that's something we have mapped at this point.
We are in the process of mapping that because we actually understand the sensitivity. If you were to allow increased density around major transit stops, regardless of headway, or with a headway of say 12 or 15 minutes, in other words, 4 buses per hour, there are implications for the city in terms of development. And so we are actually in the process of mapping that out and looking at the bus routes, looking at the frequencies, working with County Connection, working with CCTA in general, and figuring out the implications for the state law on development throughout the city and the intensity and density associated with that development.
Okay, is there a definition for the activity or at a bus stop that makes it a major transit hub?
Well, I think the typical standard applied is the headways. In other words, how frequently a bus shows at a given stop. But I will confess, I know there have been some changes relative to headways. Some in the past were 15-minute headways. Others in more recent laws, I believe, eliminate the headway requirement. If there's simply a bus stop nearby or along within a quarter mile, it is considered a transit stop, and therefore these density increases could apply because of that proximity to a bus line and a bus stop.
And Ethan and I can work together. Ethan and I can work together to get more clarity on that and give that to the commission.
Yeah, that would have a potential major impact. And, we all see the buses driving around with 3 people on them. And just because they stop every 15 minutes doesn't make it a major transportation hub. So I'm hoping there's some valid quantitative criteria that they use for establishing, or that will use establishing something as a major transit hub. So that's all.
Questions for staff at this point? I have a quick one for you, Brian, and that is, are you still planning to do the California density bonus law workshop or discussion as we move forward sometime later this year?
Yes, I'm deferring to Ethan, but I believe yes.
Yeah, the short answer is yes. We haven't figured out a date yet. Obviously, given the status of these virtual meetings, I think we're going to wait to see what the future holds. And certainly, we are working on the density bonus behind the scenes, but we'll bring it before the commission, hopefully in the near future. But definitely to come back to the commission for sure.
Yeah, I'm looking at my desk here. I have this guide to California density bonus law sitting here. And I think that this might answer some of Commissioner Pickett's questions. Actually, not all of them. I think a lot of those are really good clarifications we could use when you do that presentation. And for some reason, I can't seem to find a PDF copy of this in my electronic library. So I'm going to assume you're going to resend it out as an attachment when we get to that point. So, all right, I'll turn it back over to you to continue and finish your presentation.
And I think we're moving on to part 4. The good news is that it's the shortest part, and I think Claire's going to jump back in here.
Yes, thanks, Brian. So just to wrap up this presentation, the part 4 new laws changes is to address tenants' rights and homelessness issues. And as we were talking about in the beginning, there's 2 efforts to address the housing crisis in the state. One is, to build more housing. The other is to keep people in their current homes or to move them into permanent housing. So next slide, please. So the first set of changes is from Assembly Bill 1482, and this is the state's rent cap law. And basically, it caps rent increases, annual rent increases for current tenants at the property to CPI plus 5%, and the maximum is up to 10% annually. This applies retroactively to previously higher rent rates. So if the rent is higher pre-2020, then it has to be adjusted back to the allowable rate under the statute. This law does not preempt local rent control ordinances. So if the city has a more restrictive or a stricter law, and that law would apply instead. And also in combination, tenants living at a property for 1 or more years can only now be evicted for a specific at-fault or no-fault reason. So this is the just cause eviction statute portion. And as you can probably appreciate, at-fault is when the tenant is doing something illegal at the property, they're violating their lease or the rules of the property. And whereas no-fault is something like the property owner landlord wants to take the building off the market. They want to move in with their own family. There's a code enforcement issue that no longer makes the property livable. So in those situations, the landlord has to pay relocation benefits for these no-fault evictions. And so the state requiring landlord offering some assistance for that kind of situation. Next slide. SB 339 is really expanding on the current state law prohibition against discriminating on tenants based on income. And so this new change requires landlord not to refuse to rent to tenants for reasons of holding a Section 8 or other housing vouchers. And AB 101, which is the budget trailer bill, it allocates funding for homelessness programs and also creates financial incentives for cities to adopt pro-housing policies. It also it requires a low barrier navigation center to be permitted by right if it meets specified requirements. These centers must be allowed in mixed use zones and also non-residential zones that permit multifamily uses. And these centers are basically, they provide services to provide shelter, provide services that direct people to more permanent housing. They can have public services, health services, public benefit services, and related things like that. So this is really reflecting, again, the legislature's efforts to address homelessness and permanent housing issues that are present in the state. So that concludes our presentation. Tonight, we're happy to answer any additional questions that the commission may
Any commissioner questions of staff at this point? Commissioner Strongman?
Unmute first. Oops. Cancel.
We can hear you.
Does this, the rent cap apply to single-family residents that are used for rentals?
Does
I
it apply
believe-
to-
Yes.
Okay, Brian, take over.
No. Claire, do you?
What was the question? I'm sorry.
Does the rental cap on, AB 1482 apply to single-family houses that are used, that are rentals?
So I believe that yes, meaning, reciprocally, I do not think they are exempted. So I think the short answer is yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other commissioner questions? Okay, well, thank you for such an enlightening presentation. Obviously, a lot of heavy lifting for staff, and we wish you good luck with that. So at this, we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the commission member and staff reports or announcements. Does any one of the commissioners or any staff have an announcement at this time? Okay, well, seeing none, then we'll move to adjournment, and we'll adjourn tonight's planning commission meeting at 8:51 p.m. Thank you all very much.